Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base Biotech podcast, and this is number 14, going out on June the 20th. Although, now that it's a global podcast, it's probably already the 21st in some parts of the world, or maybe the 19th. First, some housekeeping news. We've decided that there's so much biotech news, and the fact that we have a biotech podcast, that we're going to expand the deeptechdigest.com website to include much more biotech and life sciences. So expect a big jump in articles on there in the very near future. It's already started, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Before we get going, if you do have suggestions for who should be on the podcast, and please don't say that I shouldn't, or if you have news for us or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com. That's also the address you can use if you're interested in sponsoring one or more podcasts or advertising with us. We are keeping those prices low so that it's easier to get involved, and it helps keep the podcast going too. Last week our guests were Peter Tomino, President of R&D at Nimbus Therapeutics, on the role of computational chemistry in drug discovery and development, and Alex Del Priore, Senior Vice President, Manufacturing at Syngene International Limited, about its acquisition of a biologics site in the US. This week, a little later in the show, we'll have a conversation with Kim Kraemer, CEO and founder of Waterhouse Brands. It's an interview not to miss because we're talking about reputation. Fortunately not mine, but Waterhouse Brands has helped lots of biotech, medtech and pharma companies define and build their reputation for the good of investors, patients and employees. It's a long conversation, but definitely worthwhile. First, we're talking about a treatment for a rare disease. Spastic paraplegia 47 is an ultra-rare genetic neurological disease for which no treatment currently exists, although hopefully that is soon going to change with BlackFinBio's BFB101. It's a clinical stage AP4B1 replacement AAV gene therapy. To talk about the disease and how it's being tackled and other things the company is working on is BlackFinBio CEO Peter Nolan. So I wonder if first you could tell me a little bit about the origins of BlackFinBio and the story up to this point.
Yes, sure. So BlackFinBio came out of stealth in December 2023. Prior to that, I had been working with the academic Professor Mamoon Azouz in Sheffield, where the company is spun out from. Mamoon and I go back a very long time because we both worked at Oxford Biomedica in the early 2000s. And Mamoon excelled himself by getting a couple of Nature publications which propelled him into his position as a professor at Sheffield, where he's been ever since. When I retired from Oxford Biomedica in 2018, Mamoon contacted me and I helped him on various things, but he clearly needed some help in terms of commercializing some of the many potential products he was developing at the Sheffield Institute of Translational Neuroscience. The lead program he had is the lead program of BlackFin. The first thing I did to help him was help him establish the case for Sheffield to be one of the LifeArc MRC gene therapy hubs, and he was successful in getting that. And once we got that out of the way, then we concentrated on getting the company started. So in December 23, we established the company with 2.75 million of founders' seed investment. That enabled us to kickstart the company, get going, license in the intellectual property from Sheffield, the lead program, acquire some intellectual property for the second program from our old company, Oxford Biomedica, because they are no longer a therapeutic business. They are a pure play CDMO. So we're actively keen to offload some of their intellectual property on products that they were no longer developing. So we took advantage of that. So we've essentially got the company started. We have 2 programs. First program is in hereditary spastic paraplegia. It has recently been approved as an IND by the FDA. Whilst the company was in stealth, there was a lot of work done, funded by our other co-founder, Chris Edwards, who's based in Boston, who has a daughter with the disease and this product. And he's a wealthy entrepreneur. He's funded a lot of the work, together with the philanthropy fund for LifeArc, who've also supported the program through preclinical development, to the point where on the 1st of March, we were able to file the IND. And on the 2nd of April, we received notice that it had been approved. So it's now an active open IND. We will be probably treating first patients around the end of the year. So we now have to go through the agreements with the clinical site, which is Children's Hospital Boston. And the reason for that is that the clinician there is the go-to guy for the disease that we're targeting in hereditary spastic paraplegia. He holds the patient registry, and he's also done an extensive natural history study. And so he's an obvious person to go to in that sense. He and the Children's Hospital are very keen to see this trial start. So we're waiting for the final GMP run for the material to be finished. That was also supported by LifeArc through a grant to the university. We look forward to seeing that program progress into patients. So a very exciting time, I think, to ensure that. The second program uses intellectual property from Oxford Biomedica related to their Parkinson's program. And basically, it's a technique for delivering 3 genes that expresses the 3 enzymes that you need to establish a biosynthetic pathway to make dopamine. And this is a way of making dopamine locally in the brain, in the areas of the brain that needs dopamine if you've got a deficiency of it. Clearly in Parkinson's, there's a deficiency because the substantia nigra has died. In the areas that we're focusing on, because we are a rare disease company in gene therapy, delivering our genes with a AAV9 vector, we are focusing on rare diseases related to dopamine deficiencies. In children, there are about a dozen of these diseases, and they're all extremely rare. We've gone through all of them in terms of their science and clinical challenges and market size, etc. And we've identified 4 closely related dopamine deficiency diseases that we tend to target in the first trial as a bucket trial. And once we can demonstrate using our delivery system that we can treat dopamine deficiency diseases, then we can, it's the same product, can then treat all the other dopamine deficiency diseases, including idiopathic Parkinson's, if we chose to invest in that later. So in terms of the company, the 2 programs over the next 3 years, to get the first program through the clinic, get a readout, and the second program to complete preclinical, is going to require a further £8 million to close the seed round. So we've been very active in seeking to do this, and over the last few months, we have secured a lead investor who's prepared to put in at least half, and we're now talking to a number of potential funds to come in as co-investors with the lead investor. Once we've concluded that, then we'll be off and running to get the 2 programs completed in the 3-year timeline. Beyond that, then if we get a good readout from the clinical program and the second program into the clinic, then we're going to need then to do a Series A to take the programs forward. Also, during the last period, we've recruited a CFO to come in to help as a strategic CFO to join the team. This is Darren Cunningham, very experienced CFO and biotech executive. He's been CEO and CFO in various biotech startups with 25 years experience. Because our lead program is now going clinical, we've taken on a clinical operations lady in Boston that knows Boston Children's Hospital extremely well. She used to work at Bluebird Bio and Bridge Bio, and has overseen clinical trials in children of Boston many times. So she's the perfect person to help us oversee this trial, which will be in a small number of patients. Up to 5 children will be treated in this first trial. Clearly a safety study primarily, but we will be looking for signs of efficacy, both in terms of normal rating scores, but also we have a potential biomarker that can look for evidence that the product is working. If we see all that, we'll obviously then be working to move the program through into a registration study and get it onto the market. As it's ultra rare, we have an orphan drug designation from the FDA, and we have rare pediatric drug designation from the FDA. And rare pediatric designation comes with a priority review voucher. These PRVs have been around for a while, but they have potential value once you're on the market. You can sell them to large pharmaceutical companies. I think the most recent one I saw traded was about $150 million. There is some uncertainty on the PRV program, though, because Congress didn't renew the program in the autumn, so there are no new ones coming, and there is some uncertainty as to whether there will be some grandfather clause on the existing ones. So we may have it today, but it may go tomorrow or may come back again. We just don't know. As with everything on that side of the Atlantic, there is some measure of confusion as we move forward. But we're delighted, though, that the FDA did approve our clinical trial and still seems to be keen to see the progression for ultra-rare diseases in young children to be accelerated through the clinic and onto the market.
Before we talk a little bit more about your AAV gene therapy, I wonder if you could fill me in a little bit on hereditary spastic paraplegia and what that is.
Yes, so in hereditary spastic paraplegia, there is a protein complex called AP4. And one of the genes of this complex that we're targeting is called SPD47. The gene in question, if it mutates, it causes a loss of function in that complex. And the complex itself facilitates intracellular trafficking and is essential for critical neuronal functioning. So if you get a mutation, as we have in this disease, it gives you the phenotype for hereditary spastic paraplegia. Quite often, children when born are misdiagnosed with cerebral palsy. The children do not develop their sort of intellectual capabilities at the correct pace. They have deficits, and that continues. Unlike cerebral palsy, it gets worse. And then from the age of 5, the children start to develop neuromuscular problems. And by the time they're 10, they're usually paraplegic. So not a very nice disease in young children, just down to one single gene mutation. So the whole idea of the product is to use a AAV9 gene therapy to deliver the correct version of the gene to reverse the symptoms. There is some evidence in our preclinical models that we can not just stop the disease, but potentially reverse it. We're looking forward to seeing that progress. It is an ultra-orphan disease, so the number of patients currently is quite small. But as with all these ultra-orphan diseases, they're usually misdiagnosed at birth, and we can see from the patient registry that the numbers are beginning to grow 20-30% a year, which is higher than you would expect to see if it was just the incidence of the disease increasing numbers. There are no treatments otherwise, so it is a high unmet need in these young children.
You mentioned that it's not currently treated. Is there any way of managing it, or is it merely a case of it just takes its course?
I think it takes its course. Our co-founder, who's been investing in the program up to date, has a daughter with this disease, and I think there are sometimes surgical interventions to correct some of the musculoskeletal issues, but it's not perfect. But you just see a slow progression of the disease. This is why in the clinical trial we're very keen, and the FDA accept this, that we are going into early stage patients, so between 1 and 2 years old, which is a departure from my experience in gene therapy in the past, where the first trial you would normally go into the older patients, show that it's safe, and then be allowed. These days, because it's so rare, they're more sympathetic to doing that, and they also no longer require placebo-controlled studies, randomized studies, because of the size of the market, the number of patients. It's all done through match controls and looking at the comparisons to the natural history study, for which we have extensive data.
You mentioned that there's the potential to be able to give this treatment and for it maybe even to be reversed. Does the stage at which you are able to do that make any difference?
Because we've not done it yet, we can only speculate, but I think intuitively you would understand, I think, that the earlier you intervene, the more likely you are, if you stop things in their tracks, that some of these effects of the disease being progressive are not just alleviated, but they're stopped. So it may well be that older patients do derive some benefit that will be determined by more, by clinical study.
And how does I guess your gene therapy is BFB 101, how does that actually work?
Okay, so this is injected into the spinal cord, into the back of the head. So it gets into the brain and is expressed in the bits of the brain where you need this gene to be expressed. So it's a once and done infusion.
All right. And then once it's in the brain, what's its mode of action? How does it turn back the clock, I guess?
Yeah, so by putting in the correct version of the gene into the brain, it provides an expression of the particular protein that's required that stops the mutated gene causing the issues it does in terms of the HSP phenotype. There's still things we need to learn on this. I mean, we really understand it in terms of the preclinical models that we've used, and the data from that all looks very encouraging.
Do you have anything else in the pipeline?
Yes, so we talked about the second program in dopamine deficiency diseases. The clinical trial for that was most likely to be done at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. The clinician there is Professor Purian, and she sees all the patients in the UK and Europe and beyond who have dopamine deficiency diseases, amongst other things. And she tells me that there's not much she can do for these patients because existing treatments don't work very well. So she is super keen to see us get through the preclinical work, get the program to be CTA ready, and start a clinical trial in 3 years' time. And she has a cohort of patients that she can deploy on this fairly swiftly. So we're really quite optimistic that we can demonstrate that. It will provide a very strong proof of concept that the approach works, can be used in other dopamine deficiency diseases. And as I said, that doesn't just include genetic causes of dopamine deficiency, but also potentially idiopathic Parkinson's.
Good that you'll be able to tackle some of these things that have not really had many options in the past. Yeah. As far as the FDA clearance is concerned, what does that give you the ability to do in the US with your treatment?
Yeah, well, it's a big endorsement, and it's a big milestone for the company to get the clinical trial application approved. It's a lot of work that goes into that. As we are talking to potential investors and co-investors, it strengthens the case, essentially provides sort of de-risks part of the investment case for the company that we now have an open IND and ready to treat patients. It's a big milestone.
Always heartening to hear about treatments that can truly make a difference against devastating diseases and conditions. Of course, one factor in bringing new treatments to patients is biotech companies getting funding. And a huge part of that is the drug itself and the disease in question. But biotech and life science companies can help themselves in that regard by working on their approach and their image. something that they might not have thought about. Reputational pull is a concept developed by Waterhouse Brands, a US company that has helped many biotech and life science companies over the years. To find out what reputational pull is, among other things, and how your company can benefit, we had a wide-ranging conversation with Waterhouse Brands CEO and founder, Kim Kraemer.
I guess the first question then is, before we start talking about reputation, if you could explain what Waterhouse Brands is and what you do.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for being curious about the role of reputation and Waterhouse's work in helping companies architect their reputation. So Waterhouse Brands is a brand reputation agency that works fairly exclusively with emerging and fast growth life sciences companies to architect their competitive advantage. And we do this by helping CEOs identify their ideal market positioning, their culture, cultural ethos, which includes their mission, vision, and values, and crafting their brand image to help them stand out in an often competitive category or space, depending on where they're playing. So our goal of this work in helping companies create competitive advantage is to help them become recognized as an investment of choice, a partner of choice, and an employer of choice.
All right. One of the things that you mention is reputational pull. Could you explain what that term means?
Absolutely. So we specialize in building what we call reputational pull, which I think of as a feeling. It's that feeling that you know it when you experience it, when investors want in, when top talent wants to work for your company, and when partners across the healthcare ecosystem believe in your mission and want to become part of your success journey. So with that in mind, when companies focus on doing what we call aligning 3 essential elements of their company reputation, which includes leadership vision, company culture, and brand image, they are able to more likely and successfully attract top-tier investors, recruit more quickly the highest caliber of talent from the industry, and to bring partners to them. So reputational pull is almost a magnetic force, this gravitational pull that is the result of how a company engages the market. It's in return how the market engages a company. And we can measure successful company engagement by looking at not just increase in things like share price or market cap or invitations to speaking engagements or increased engagement on social channels and websites, but decreases in the cost of things like recruiting and having to hire outbound recruiters who are promoting your company outbound. So all of these things, these measures work together to help us create a picture of a company's reputation. And that may be a little bit more surface level. We can also look more deeply into whether a company is actively doing the right things to put itself in a strong reputational position.
More specifically talking about the biotech life sciences sector because of the nature of the podcast. So do life sciences and biotech companies get that, or do they say, well, why does that matter to me?
It's a great question. I would say that historically, when we would talk to CEOs of smaller and even earlier stage publicly traded companies, so R&D stage companies, CEOs often thought that their most important audience at all cost was investors. If you ask them to prioritize their target audiences, whether it was FDA, patient advocacy groups, physicians, patients, or investigators, or investors and employees would always be at the bottom of the list. So we have had to help them shift their mindset to think more holistically about the importance of thinking equally about the role each of their audiences plays in the ecosystem in contributing towards their success. So we always start by helping companies think about what's the end game here? If we play the long game, who should care about our company and why? And how do we have to inform them and engage them in the right ways, provide them with the right level of access and information so that they're working with us productively across our journey?
And how do they, in that respect, prioritize those different levels?
Right. We encourage companies to think about who we see as the three most important audiences in showing up for authentically and strategically. And that's investors, partners, and employees. From our point of view, at the earliest of days, those stakeholders are the ones that really can make or break a company's success. And so we help them take steps back and say, let's architect our journey here. Let's start by ensuring we know where we're going, how we're going to get there, and have clarity of your vision and map that to our culture, which are our values, beliefs, behaviors, and then translate that into the image of how we show up in the marketplace.
Are there different factors and challenges depending on the industry sector?
Absolutely. So the nice thing about life sciences is that we generally know the pathway. Assets get developed or discovered, then they move into clinical development. We know that there is a long journey of engagement with the FDA as the company works to get data. And we can understand what the traditional milestones and catalysts of success will be and help a company think about how are we going to show up? How are we going to align our team around not just where we're going, but the priorities each day that we have from a clinical, regulatory, and pre-commercial standpoint. And one of the things that we're seeing companies take more seriously early on is to architect a value proposition, not just for patients and prescribers, but for payers. And having clarity of the entire level of engagement they need to have with each of the audiences in this ecosystem helps companies get from A to B much more expeditiously and clear-eyed.
Earlier, you mentioned capital being something that's very important to a lot of life sciences companies. How do you think companies best transform themselves to set themselves apart or improve their reputation? Because if you look at any given field within the life sciences, most companies are one of many in a certain area. How do they set themselves apart?
It all starts with differentiation. We tell clients it's not enough to position yourself as simply better than your competition. You have to be able to articulate what makes you fundamentally different. What is it about your technology platform, your scientific insights, your business model, your team, or your access to the top tier talent, whether they're advisors or investigators, that help you stand out in the market? And what that does is it creates belief. So in helping C-suite teams think about who do we need to be in order to be successful, it's this confluence of not just what we're going to do and execute, but how we are going to engage the market each step of the way to create that belief. And it's particularly important now at a time when capital, traditional capital, is scarce, right? With generalists fleeing the investment sector, retail investors may fill the void. And whether they are mission-driven investors or family offices or some of the different types of private equity groups that often stand in, including in individuals, reputation can help fill the void for risk when those groups of investors might not necessarily have the access to doing due diligence and the kind of research that institutions have. So reputation becomes far more important right? You want to be visible. You want every member of the audience group to understand why they should care about us, why they should believe in us. So it's really having clarity of our strategy, alignment of our organization that we can and will execute, and then an ability to communicate the impact we'll make in the markets we serve.
I would assume that every company is different in both their needs and the existing skills that they have. When it comes to working on that and developing that, what do you actually do for the companies? Do you help them with their communication strategy or their personal communication skills, or how do you work with a plan to get them from A to B?
That's a great question. Absolutely, a CEO and leadership team's ability to communicate and believe in the power of communications is important, but that's not where we start. We start with architecting a strategy and working with leaders using our Align methodology, which is a 5-part framework that I actually developed when I led the rebrand of Gilead in 2001. It was about a year post-merger with a UK-based company, Nexstar. And we developed this methodology to create a framework to help leaders and their boards and their employees become part of a process that starts with understanding where are we today versus where do we need to be? Who do we need to get inputs in? So Align stands for assess. So we assess the current situation, listen to the key stakeholders, taking a 360-degree view of the company by including voices of board, investors, sometimes media, former executives, current employees, and the leadership team. And we conduct qualitative and quantitative analysis to really identify the key themes that would help a company in our interpret phase deliver insights around how they're showing up in the market. So it starts with understanding perception, starts with looking at the competitive landscape, thinking about where can this company play and win and have clarity of their category positioning so that they can be differentiated. And then we look internally at understanding, are there any organizational or operational barriers that will become impediments to our success? And we look at perhaps uncovered opportunities or opportunities that others in the company's orbit may see, but the C-suite hasn't truly considered or interrogated. And so we also look from there at the culture of the company. Does this company have what it takes to work together in a really cohesive way to not just deliver the goals of the day-to-day, but meet the expectations that companies are setting with their investors, with their boards, and other constituencies. From there, we formulate a clear point of view and a brand platform and positioning that helps a company tell its story in an extremely differentiated, credible, authentic, and compelling way. And we put all the visual and verbal brand assets around that to bring that story to life. And our last step is really about navigating next steps, which is how do we launch this brand, this story into the market? And how do we create uptake? Who needs to hear it? What messaging needs to be distinctive for different audience groups, yet sharing that common umbrella story? So that's generally the process, which interrogates company vision, company culture, and how we're going to show up in the market in our brand image.
And then once you've got those strategies, how do you kind of implement those?
It's a great question. It really does start with the CEO and the leadership team being clear that this is our pathway to success. When you have an executive team who is all on the same page and can articulate the company story to each of the distinct audience groups in a very consistent, cohesive way. And when you have employees that really believe it and become ambassadors for your company's mission, it's a very powerful force. And so instituting it or bringing it to life really is an inside-out journey that starts with a shared commitment, coming back to reputation, to create the kind of reputation that will enable our success, not just today or in the short term, but for years to come. And that is very antithetical to how we think about reputation traditionally, which is something that tends to be the first thing top of mind when crisis hits or something in the business goes sideways and it spills from the inside into the outside world. Reputation becomes something to be managed. So we like to work with our team executives to think of it as reputation prehab versus reputation rehab. And everything they do, from articulating the strategy to ensuring employees are aligned and all pulling in the same direction, to how they communicate with consistency, transparency, and authenticity, really does help them craft that reputation and set them apart.
Do you do that internally first and then reflect that externally, or are they all steps that have to be managed simultaneously so that you're dealing with internal and external at the same time?
How we approach architecting a reputation or communications and brand go-to-market strategy is really dependent on what stage of growth the company is at. For earlier stage companies that are just thinking about how to emerge from stealth, it's easier to take a blank sheet of paper and say, okay, this is who we are going to be. This is how we are going to position our assets and our technology and how we're going to architect or articulate the culture that is more aspirational, that will set us up for success. For companies that have a track record or history, it's more in depth and you have to be able to work in parallel, right? You can't just say, first we're going to develop the narrative, then the messaging, then the website, and then the press release, and then launch. It's more about, okay, we truly have to recognize that we are at an inflection point or a pivot point in our business. And that can be due to any number of factors. It could be due to a CEO management change. It could be due to a shift in business strategy, can be due to an acquisition or a merger that requires a complete rethinking of how we articulate our story, our value proposition, and the culture that will enable us to scale successfully. So with that in mind, it's important for companies to first be willing to do the work and say, let's keep business going in parallel, and as a leadership team, take a step back and ask ourselves the hard question: is what got us here going to get us to the next level? And if the answer to that is no, or maybe, but we could do better, then oftentimes they'll go through, this process is very timely because it's one of reflection and discovery. And the output is about having clarity of where we're going and having a clear path forward, not just with an executive team, helps them better engage employees around change and new opportunities that the company needs to unlock. And it also helps with engaging the board and letting the board know that we do have a clearly articulated strategy that we are going to put into the market in a methodical way to re-engage our different stakeholder groups.
Obviously, when you're talking about companies that are just developing, it's not easy to do, but you can develop that clear strategy and point them in a particular direction. What about the companies that either are down the wrong path or have already got a bad reputation? How can you remodel some of those difficulties?
It's always a challenge, depending on the reputational hit that a company has experienced or the strategic shift that they would like to make.
How do you measure the success of your program?
Many of the metrics we use to measure success can be loosely correlated with things like market cap. They are a company that has created reputational pull. They actively, frequently, because they're so committed to their science and medical credibility, have published frequently. They present at medical conferences. They have strong relationships with advocacy groups and with KOLs. They fund investigator-sponsored studies, and they continue through patient access work to support patient communities. So as we look at reputational pull, it's about, are we helping them tell a clear story for investors and each of their audience groups? Is that well understood? Are we getting more inbound requests and resumes? If you look at it from a recruiting and employer brand standpoint, is it faster and easier? I mean, it gets easier the more cohesive your message is, the more consistent your leaders and brand ambassadors are in telling your story. And the proof really is in soft and hard metrics.
I think with a lot of companies, not just in science, in any particular business, there's often a skill set that people go into that business possessing. So if it's a life science company, they understand the science and they're coming in with that science background, but don't have the skills in marketing, business planning, finance. So they're having to gain all of these extra skills that they didn't even know that they needed. Are there common mistakes that companies make or challenges that they face that you go in and can see initially that need to change?
I think the nuances for each company may be different. And there's certainly, it does start with the CEO in terms of their openness and willingness to think of communications and brand and reputation as a strategic imperative versus a necessary evil. And in life sciences and in smaller biotech in particular, we see CEOs who do come out of the science side, or they've risen through the ranks as a CMO or CSO and have the opportunity to then go lead a venture-funded startup. What I've found is that most CEOs I've worked with are so intelligent that they know what they don't know, and they are willing to recognize that it's important to look strategically and holistically at how do our fundraising strategy, our communications of milestones strategy, and how we engage employees. I think that's the lagging indicator, is companies' willingness to truly value culture as a competitive advantage. And we are very focused on helping CEOs develop these well-rounded ways of thinking about the audience ecosystem. I think you're right, though, that leadership teams, CEOs in particular of smaller companies, may lack a skill set. And one of the things I've been fascinated by is the Termeer Foundation. I would give them really big props. They have CEO cohorts now, and they are actively focused on helping to educate and cultivate the next generation of leaders. So I have great hope that while our industry is evolving, and of course, leaders bring different types of skill sets to the table, that conveners like the Termeer Foundation and even some of the venture ecosystems like Flagship are doing the work to help prepare this next generation of CEOs to think more broadly than just about the clinical trial and the data. And of course, there is no company if you don't have an asset with data and a clinical program with rigor and the ability to demonstrate safety and efficacy and outcomes and have clarity of value proposition to patients, prescribers, and payers. There's no company. But the rest, in this day and age, where we live in a 24/7 integrated world, where it's not incumbent upon the CEO to just meter out information, it's more about how do we build relationships across the board as the cornerstone of our company's reputation and value creation strategy.
Now, everything changes, not just the company landscape. We've got artificial intelligence, and there's so many different aspects to business now. How are you evolving in order to meet those changing needs of companies?
We're always evolving as a firm, looking at what are the needs in the market. And, just like 8 years ago, we launched Waterhouse to bring together, build a bridge between HR and corporate communications, recognizing that corporate and employer brand are two sides of the same coin. We're also looking at how the market is changing towards needing to target audiences in different ways and engage them. So as we think about how the industry is evolving, the needs of our companies and our clients, which we see as being more focused on how to tell the story, not just to investors, but to prospective partners, how to integrate a point of view and messaging about the payer value opportunity, and working with the government effectively. I think, unfortunately, we are in a period of time where there is so much uncertainty and chaos in the marketplace that it's a natural tendency for C-suite to want to retreat and not say anything. So we continue to work with companies to strike the balance and make sure they're not going silent, but having a message that is still credible and that they're not inadvertently creating more uncertainty by saying nothing.
And there are so many different communication channels now that there never were before. So I guess it's important to know how to get the message across and how to utilize that best, I guess.
Absolutely. I think it all starts with smart strategy and then making sure you know the best channel and the best message to engage your stakeholders and meet them where they're at. And we are, to your point, moving into a period where AI has really become less about drug discovery and more about integration into every fabric of the organization. So working with companies to think about, is our category shifting? Like, are we a tech biotech company, or how does integration of new tools and capabilities evolve the way we work and engage as a team? So we're working a lot with companies to not just lean into the tech ethos of move fast and break things, but to stay true to the principles of bringing great science into the clinic, translating that into data and outcomes, launching it into the world, doing it with clarity of strategy, consistency of message, and showing up in a way that's truly differentiated.
Is the concept of reputation itself changing?
I think the definition of reputation is still one that is about the perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs that an end user, whether it's a patient, prescriber, or consumer, have about your company. What, in my mind, needs to change is to think about reputation less as something to be dealt with and managed during times of crisis, and more something that we can proactively architect by understanding our needs to engage with each member in the audience ecosystem, from KOLs, investors, payers, prescribers, and patients and advocacy groups, and working with our internal leadership team and employees to have clarity of the values and behaviors that are going to help us build the kind of reputation we need for success. And we truly believe that having reputation as a key strategic priority not only helps mitigate risk, it helps you create lift in the market perception, because coming back to the concept of reputational pull, People want to be associated with a company that's doing the right things in the right way and a brand that makes them feel good, that has a very altruistic, innovative mission and the goods to back it up. We believe that that is the concept of reputation prehab versus reputation rehab. So we're advocating flipping the script. Don't wait until there's a problem. Get ahead of this. Think about this as part of your core business strategy. You not only mitigate risk by having a good reputation when times do get tough, it provides a safe harbor. In times of change, companies need two things, right? Strategic clarity and organizational alignment. The payoff of reputation can be with stronger valuations. There are studies, the state of corporate reputation, that demonstrate that 63% of a company's overall value can be attributed to reputation. And we know that from other studies that the number one factor that influences a prescriber to write a script is company reputation after, of course, having safety and efficacy. And we know from global HR leaders that 70% of a company's ability to recruit top talent is attributed to having a strong, indisputable reputation. I think it's really important for companies to think about reputation as a form of capital to ensure, especially now in this market moment, to understand perceptions, make sure that they are doing the work to differentiate themselves in a crowded space, not just for investors, but for partners. For every deal that gets done, there's probably 20 that didn't get done. So making sure that you are clearly articulating what's unique and different, whether that's your technology platform, your scientific insight, your business model, your team capabilities, your outcomes, your real world competitive advantage, and having a point of view on price. I think all of these factors help a company articulate what makes it not just better than the competition, but fundamentally different and an investable, partnerable story. I also think making sure that companies recognize that culture is the engine behind their reputation, to stay focused on that, and that putting yourself out there and being a thought leader is not really optional. If you have investor dollars and you have an innovation engine or an asset, you really need to do the work to help shape the market perception, not let it shape the results of your company story. Reputation isn't a nice to have, it's a strategic imperative.
I hope you found that as interesting and hopefully as useful as I did. Well, that's it for another podcast. If you have questions, comments, suggestions for guests, or want to sponsor one or preferably more podcasts, please do get in touch. And you can do so at jim@deeptechdigest.com. So until next week, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast.
The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.